Imagine holding a piece of paper in your hands. Just a simple bus ticket. Faded, yellow with age, the ink barely legible after 60 years. But this isn't just any ticket. This is a portal to one of the most dangerous journeys a person could take in America. The year is 1963. The destination? Somewhere deep in the American South. And if you were black, buying this ticket meant you might not come home alive. Today, we're not just talking about a bus ticket. We're talking about courage that defied death threats. We're talking about ordinary people who became extraordinary heroes. And we're talking about a movement that changed the world, one bus ride at a time. Stay with me, because what happened on these Greyhound buses will shock you, inspire you, and might just change how you see the world today. Before I tell you what made these bus rides so terrifying, let me paint you a picture of what it meant to step onto a Greyhound bus in 1963 if your skin was the wrong color. Picture this. You're standing at a bus terminal in Washington, D.C. You've just purchased your ticket to Birmingham, Alabama. The clerk looked at you with contempt as he slid the ticket across the counter. You clutch it in your hand, and your palms are sweating. Not from heat, though it's May, and the South is already sweltering. No, you're sweating because you know what's waiting for you down there. You've heard the stories. Just 2 years ago, in 1961, Freedom Riders had their buses firebombed. Burned alive. That's what nearly happened to them outside Anniston, Alabama. The mob surrounded the bus, slashed the tires, and threw a firebomb through a broken window. People barely escaped with their lives, choking on smoke, crawling through windows while the crowd cheered. But here's what's even more chilling. That wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic, calculated terror campaign designed to keep people like you in your place. And everyone knew it. The FBI knew it. Local police knew it. Hell, some of them participated in it. The government knew it. And still, these buses rolled south. Now here's the question that should be burning in your mind right now. Why would anyone buy that ticket? Why would anyone willingly board a bus knowing they might face a mob, knowing they might be beaten unconscious, knowing they might never make it home? Let me take you back to understand what that bus ticket really represented. In 1963, America was two countries sharing the same borders. If you lived in the North, you might have believed the United States was becoming more progressive. The Supreme Court had ruled school segregation unconstitutional almost a decade earlier in Brown versus Board of Education. Things were supposed to be changing. But in the South was a different universe entirely. That Greyhound ticket wasn't just permission to travel. It was a key to a nightmarish parallel dimension where the laws of humanity seemed suspended, where the Constitution was just words on paper, and where your life could end because you sat in the wrong seat. See, the interstate bus system was supposed to be desegregated. The Supreme Court had ruled in Boynton versus Virginia in 1960 that racial segregation in public transportation was unconstitutional. But here's the cruel irony. Having a law and enforcing a law are two completely different things. In the South, those laws were ignored with impunity. And if you tried to exercise your constitutional rights, you'd learn very quickly that the police weren't there to protect you. The segregation signs told the story. Whites only and colored weren't just suggestions. They were lines drawn in blood. The waiting rooms were separate. The water fountains were separate. Even the bathrooms were separate. And facilities for black travelers were deliberately inferior, often filthy, sometimes non-existent. But it was the seats on the bus that became the battleground. Black passengers were expected to sit in the back. Always. Even if the front was empty and the back was crowded. Even if you were elderly, pregnant, or disabled. The front of the bus was white territory, and crossing that invisible line could get you arrested, beaten, or killed. Now, let's talk about the people who bought those tickets anyway. These weren't professional activists, at least not at first. They were students, college kids, young people in their teens and early 20s who decided they'd had enough. They called themselves Freedom Riders, and they were willing to put their bodies on a line to expose the hypocrisy of American democracy. The strategy was brilliantly simple and terrifyingly dangerous. Buy a bus ticket, board the bus, sit wherever you wanted, regardless of your race. Refuse to move, And when violence came, because it would come, don't fight back. Nonviolent resistance. That was the key. Let the world see what hatred looks like when it has no shame. Let the cameras capture what happens when you ask for nothing more than human dignity. Let me tell you about some of these riders. John Lewis, a young seminary student who would later become a congressman, was beaten unconscious in Rock Hill, South Carolina. His skull was fractured. He was 21 years old. When asked if he was afraid, he said he was terrified, but he got back on the bus. Jim Zwerg, a white student from Wisconsin, had his teeth knocked out and his face beaten so badly he was unrecognizable. When reporters found him in the hospital, blood still dripping from his face, he said he'd do it again, and he meant it. Diane Nash, a brilliant strategist just 23 years old, coordinated rides from Nashville even as the violence escalated. When people suggested calling off the rides after the firebombing, she refused. If we stop now, she said, the movement is dead. These weren't people with a death wish. They were people who understood something profound. Some things are worth dying for. And freedom, real freedom, not the pretend version that existed on paper, was one of those things. So what actually happened when you boarded that bus? Let's walk through it step by step, because every mile brought you closer to danger. The early part of the journey wasn't too bad. Washington, Virginia, you might encounter hostility, but it was usually verbal. Sneers, slurs, the occasional threat. Tense, but manageable. But as the bus rolled further south, the temperature changed. Not just the weather. Though it got hotter, the atmosphere itself became heavier, more menacing. You could feel it in the way people looked at you, in the silence that fell when integrated groups entered a terminal, in the police who watched but did nothing to protect you. By the time you hit the deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, all pretense of civilization evaporated. In Anniston, Alabama, a mob of 200 people surrounded the bus. They had clubs, pipes, iron bars. The police were nowhere to be found, or rather, they were there, just not intervening. Someone slashed the tires. The bus tried to leave anyway, limping on flat tires to the city limits, where it finally died. That's when the firebomb came through the window. Think about that moment. You're trapped in a metal tube filling with smoke. Outside, there's a mob that wants you dead. The doors are blocked. Your lungs are burning. This is how it ends. You think, this is how I die. But some people escaped. They crawled through windows, coughing, gasping, their eyes streaming. And even then, even as they stumbled out, the mob beat them. An undercover state investigator had to pull out his gun and fire a warning shot to keep the crowd back long enough for people to survive. In Birmingham, the police chief Bull Connor, a name that should live in infamy, gave the Ku Klux Klan 15 minutes of free time before the police would respond. 15 minutes to do whatever they wanted to the Freedom Riders arriving at the station. 15 minutes. Think about how long that is when fists and metal pipes are raining down on you. Now, you might be wondering, did it work? Was it worth it? Here's the thing about those bus tickets. They weren't really about the buses at all. Every ticket purchased, every ride taken, every beating endured was a spotlight shining on the gap between American ideals and American reality. These riders forced the nation to look at itself in the mirror, and what the nation saw was ugly. The violence was so extreme, so undeniable, that even people who wanted to look away couldn't. Newspapers around the world ran photos of burning buses and bloody protesters. The United States, the supposed leader of the free world, was revealed as a nation that couldn't protect its own citizens from lynch mobs. The Kennedy administration, which had been hesitant to intervene, finally had no choice. The Interstate Commerce Commission issued regulations prohibiting segregation in interstate travel. Federal marshals were sent to protect riders. Slowly, painfully, the walls began to crack. But here's what doesn't make it into most history books. It wasn't guaranteed to work. These riders didn't know they'd succeed. They bought those tickets knowing they might die for nothing, knowing their sacrifice might be forgotten, knowing the movement might fail. They did it anyway. Let me share some stories you probably never heard in school. There was a woman named Lucretia Collins who rode in 1961. She was only 21, a student at Tennessee State. When the bus stopped in Jackson, Mississippi, she and other riders were arrested for using white facilities. She spent 40 days in the notorious Parchman Prison, a hellhole where the windows were taken out in winter to freeze the prisoners, where the lights were kept on 24/7 to prevent sleep, where mattresses were confiscated and protesters were left to sleep on metal springs. 40 days. She returned to college afterward and finished her degree. Most people never knew what she'd done. There was a man named Hank Thomas, a 19-year-old student, who was on that burning bus in Anniston. After he escaped and recovered, he got on another bus and continued the ride. When asked why, he said simply, "I'm not going to let them win." There were hundreds of others whose names we'll never know. People who bought tickets, who stood up, who refused to sit in the back. People who were arrested, beaten, traumatized, and who kept going anyway. And here's what gets me. Many of them were so young. College students, teenagers, people who should have been worrying about exams and dating, not whether they'd survived the trip to Alabama. That simple bus ticket, that piece of paper that probably cost around $20 or $30 in 1963 money, had effects that rippled out far beyond anyone's imagination. The Freedom Rides directly inspired the March on Washington in 1963. They showed that direct action worked, that sacrifice meant something, that change was possible. They proved that ordinary people could force the most powerful nation on earth to confront its sins. They helped create the coalition that would push through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, laws that finally, legally, ended segregation and protected voting rights. But more than that, they changed what people believed was possible. Before the Freedom Rides, many people thought segregation was permanent. It was just the way things were. The South would never change. Fighting was pointless. After the Freedom Rides, that certainty evaporated. Suddenly, the impossible seemed possible. The immovable could be moved. The powerful could be challenged. And that's a lesson that echoes through every social movement since. So what does a 1963 bus ticket mean for us today? 60 years later? First, it's a reminder that progress is never inevitable. Every right we take for granted, from integrated schools to voting rights to equal accommodations, was won by people who sacrificed, who bled, who died. These things didn't happen because of the arc of history bending toward justice. They happened because people bent it with their bare hands at great cost. Second, it's a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The Freedom Riders weren't superheroes. They were college students. They were scared. They had families who begged them not to go. They had every reason to stay home and stay safe. But they went anyway. Third, it's a reminder that change requires risk. Real change, transformative change, doesn't come from doing what's comfortable. It comes from people willing to put something on the line. Their comfort, their safety, sometimes their lives. You know what strikes me most about those bus tickets? The mundane nature of them. They look like any other ticket. Same company logo, same fare information, same departure times. Nothing about the ticket itself indicated that buying it was an act of rebellion, an act of courage, an act that could change history. But it was. Let's talk about something that often gets glossed over. What happened to these riders after the buses stopped rolling? Many of them were arrested and got criminal records that followed them for life. Jobs they couldn't get because employers saw arrested for disturbing the peace or violation of local ordinances. Polite legal terms for demanding human dignity. Some of them suffered from PTSD before we even had a name for it. The beatings, the terror, the close calls with death. These things don't just disappear when the bus reaches its destination. Relationships were destroyed. Families were torn apart. Some riders were disowned by their own parents for bringing shame on the family. John Lewis carried scars on his body for the rest of his life, and he considered them badges of honor, part of what he called good trouble. But not everyone made peace with their trauma. Some riders quietly suffered for decades, their sacrifice known only to themselves and a few others. They carried the weight of what they'd done, what they'd witnessed, what had been done to them. And yet, when interviewed decades later, almost all of them said they'd do it again. That should tell you something about the depth of their commitment. Here's an uncomfortable truth. The journey that started with those bus tickets isn't over. Yes, you can sit wherever you want on a bus today. Yes, segregation is illegal. Yes, things have changed. But the spirit that motivated those laws, the belief that some people are worth less than others, didn't die just because the signs came down. The tactics changed. The rhetoric became more subtle. But the underlying issue, equality, dignity, justice, remains contested ground. Every generation has to decide. Are we going to be the people who buy the ticket? Who take the risk? Who stand up even when standing up is dangerous? Or are we going to be the people who watched from the sidelines in 1963, who saw the buses burning and the riders bleeding and said, "That's terrible, but what can I do?" That bus ticket is more than a historical artifact. It's a question posed to every generation. What are you willing to risk for justice? The Freedom Riders knew something we sometimes forget. Freedom isn't free. That sounds like a cliche, but it's literally true. Freedom has a price, and someone has to pay it. For too long, marginalized communities have been the ones paying that price. They bought the tickets. They took the beatings. They did the dying. The question for the rest of us is, are we willing to share that burden? The Greyhound bus ticket represents a choice. Every day, we face smaller versions of that choice. Do we speak up when we witness injustice, or do we stay silent? Do we stand with the vulnerable, or do we protect our own comfort? Do we risk something? Anything for a more just world? Those riders weren't saints. They were people who made a decision. And every day, we make decisions too. Smaller decisions, perhaps less dramatic, but decisions that accumulate, that add up, that determine what kind of society we create. So here we are, 60 years later, looking back at a simple bus ticket. That piece of paper was a declaration of war against injustice. It was a bet that courage could overcome hatred. It was a gamble that the truth, once exposed, would be undeniable. And they won that bet. Not easily, not cleanly, not without tremendous cost. But they won. The next time you're on a bus or a train or a plane and you sit wherever you want without thinking twice, remember that someone bled for that right. Someone faced a mob for that right. Someone got on a bus knowing they might never get off, just so you could sit where you pleased. That's what that 1963 Greyhound bus ticket represents. The price of freedom, paid in full by people who refuse to accept a world built on lies. Their courage asks something of us. Not that we face the same violence, though some still do, but that we honor their sacrifice by continuing the work, by standing up in our own ways, in our own times, against our own injustices, because the bus is still rolling. The journey isn't over, and every one of us, whether we realize it or not, has already bought a ticket. The only question is, what are we going to do with it? This is the story of a bus ticket, but it's also the story of what makes us human, our capacity for courage, for sacrifice, for believing that tomorrow can be better than today. So here's my question for you, and I really want you to think about it. If you had lived in 1963, would you have bought that ticket? Would you have gotten on that bus? And more importantly, what's the equivalent ticket you need to buy today? Let me know in the comments. I genuinely want to hear your thoughts. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of something important, subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell, because there are hundreds of stories like this one. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories that our history books glossed over. Stories that need to be told. The Freedom Riders rode so we could be free. The least we can do is remember their names, honor their sacrifice, and continue their work. Thanks for listening. See you in the next one. And